Welcome to the How to Better Serve Justice-Involved Veterans webinar series. I have the pleasure of introducing this webinar's expert speaker, Ms. Corinne Holmes. Mrs. Holmes is a director at Smart Policy Works and has over a decade of experience working with veterans and their families. As you may know, Smart Policy Works' mission is to reduce barriers and enhance systems for vulnerable populations. Ms. Holmes and others at Smart Policy Works turn that mission into reality through their collaboration with organizations such as yourselves and through their trainings like this webinar series. Through her work, she has learned that veterans have very unique needs, and her goal for these trainings and partnerships is to increase and bring more community awareness about veteran-specific resources or needs and resources to address those needs. Smart Policy Works encourages the use of these resources to enhance the services that you are already delivering to veterans. Working with the veteran justice-involved population, or just working with the justice-involved population in general, can be very challenging because there are very often times when you have limited resources to ensure a successful transition back to civilian life. This webinar series is designed then to help providers, case managers, and other individuals who have the first interactions with justice-involved veterans pre- and post-release with tools and specific information on veteran resources and benefits. Today, Ms. Holmes is going to tell you about how to understand and connect with veterans.
So over the next probably about 50 minutes, I'm going to kind of be going over and highlighting some key information about military culture. Veterans, I'll talk a little bit about veterans, the justice-involved veteran populations, and some strategies to possibly help you form meaningful partnerships with your veteran clients. I'll also touch on a few resources, but I'm going to more just provide a vast overview, but in future webinars, we'll be going more in depth about the different benefits that justice-involved veterans may be eligible for in future webinar series. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on working information that we've learned through working with partnering veteran organizations, veteran themselves, and I'll also be drawing some from my personal experience with lived experience being a veteran and active duty service member myself. So again, thank you everybody for taking some time to listen to our webinar, and I look forward to partnering and working with everybody in the future. So what I wanted to do a little bit first of all is just provide some basic information to give a background on this type of population. This is basic information about the military, and then I'll also talk a little bit about the veteran population. So it's really important when we are, working and with individuals to really have an understanding about their culture, their background, to be able to kind of build that rapport and really understand what their needs are in the future. So the military is really comparable, if you look at it, to any other culture. Well, some of the things I'll kind of be talking about is the different branches, some components, how people enter the military. There's some key information that's, veterans themselves want community providers and civilians to know. Very few individuals in the United States have that opportunity to serve. It's really less than 1% of the population. So these are kind of just some key basic information about the military. One thing I will say is that it is an organization that is constantly evolving. I always suggest if you're working with this population or veterans that you continue to have culturally get some information on the military and the culture because it's constantly changing, because it's an ever evolving community. I'm also going to touch on a couple of some information about the transitioning home and some of the challenges that veterans face when they're transitioning back to community. So first, I'm going to kind of go over the branches. So up until very, very recently, we had 5 branches in the military. There are actually 6 branches now, Space Force being the very newest. So you may still see some literature out there that shows we have 5 branches of the military, but we do have 6 as of December 20th, 2019. Each branch of the military has its own unique mission. And that is comprised of either protecting Americans in our way of life through air, land, sea, cyberspace, and very soon through orbit, with the 6 branches of the armed forces. Each offers an individual a completely different experience and purpose. One thing, it's not common for a service member to switch a branch. They generally do stay in one branch the entire time that they are in the armed forces. Veterans, on average, do spend quite a bit of time in the military, whether on active duty or in the reserves. The average length of service is about 15 years for enlisted individuals and about 11 years for officers. So they do spend a significant time in the military that can have a profound impact on their lives. People who join the military not only can choose different branches, but they can also choose different paths of service. These paths or components can again provide soldier or service members with their own unique individual experiences. And I'm going to talk a little about these different components. So there's I think sometimes generally people think about when they think about service members is the active duty. These are the men and the women, who serve every single day. They're stationed all around the world. They're deeply embedded in the military community, and also so are their families. A majority of veterans who serve, or service members who serve on active duty qualify for a majority of the benefits that exist. And transitioning for them may look a little bit differently because they're leaving that community and returning to a community that in the civilian world. So that transition process is a little bit more in depth than somebody who is maybe a part of another component I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide, who maybe don't do this every day. So there's different paths within the military. Active is just one way that people serve the country. The second one is through the reserve component. So the reserve component is actually broken down into 2, but the reserves the military has a reserve component, and it's actually attached to the federal government. They are under the control. They are designed to augment active duty units, and they're expected to be fully deployable. They can also not just, they can be deployed all over the world, but they are really entities that this is what they do part-time, but they're ready to be activated, to deploy, to augment the active duty component. And they can also be called by Congress or in a limited time frame by the president to support domestic operations that may be happening around the country in a state of an emergency. So they can also help out with things that are happening to kind of help stabilize situations here. But individuals in the reserves can be deployed versus the next component, which is the National Guard. So the National Guard is kind of really organized. They're actually dual mission. So they get called. They do 1 week a month, 1 weekend a month. They train and are ready to help the state, but they are also ready to be deployed and help the federal government. So they are kind of dual mission. What's different about the reserve component compared to the active duty outside of this is what they do every day? In the reserve component, service members are really embedded in their communities. They live in the communities. They may have full-time jobs. A majority of them do in the communities outside of the military. And this is what they do part-time. But because of that, they may or may not be ever reach that veteran status. There are time limit, or there are time requirements for them to be called up for federal active duty in order for them to be considered a veteran. So this population here may not be eligible if they're in the National Guard or if they are in the reserves for a lot of the benefits if they weren't deployed or called up to active duty for a period of time. And each program varies in when it comes to veteran benefits, and we'll go more in depth at that with future webinars that'll talk about each one of the benefits and who's eligible and what service constitute eligibility for those benefits. So there are definitely 3 different components. This is really important to know because when you're working with justice-involved veterans, they may have served on active duty, may have served in the reserves, or they may have worked in the National Guard. And it's going to offer 2 different experiences. The National Guard specifically, service members work for the governor. They can be called up by the governor, but they also do work for the federal government. And I think it's really important to understand that piece because we've seen it recently with the civil disturbance and National Guard units being called up and people not really fully understanding what their role was. And it really is to serve and protect the community. And serving and protecting the community is making sure that the community, that, businesses and people are protected. And they're not necessarily the active duty component, which, it kind of protects us and our critical infrastructures about outside enemy forces. We work predominantly, the National Guard works predominantly more with protecting our states and protecting people and their freedom and their rights of expression. So people, it's really kind of important to know when we talk about the different military being a culture, when you look at it compared to other cultures, the military has some of the same traditions, or they have their own unique traditions. They have, if you look at other cultures that have a certain type of dress, the military has that too. They have their own unique language, core values, and it's very similar to other cultures when you think of the things that exist that makes that a culture. You will see that too in the military. And it's unique and it changes from branch to branch, component to component. There are subcultures that exist within the military. And within the subcultures have their own unique traditions, such as a component or a branch has their own language. They have their own colors and uniforms and traditions. And a subculture can also does exist in the military, what type of job a person does. There is traditions and songs associated with the job or the military occupational specialty, regardless of what component a service member is in. If they're active duty, if they are National Guard, if they're reserve, they all go to the same schools. There isn't a different school for a reserve component. They all go to the same schools and they all learn the same basic principles, and each military occupational specialty has its own unique training and traditions and history associated with that skill. And each, military occupational specialty or job actually has its own what we call cores. One example being I'm in the Signal Corps, and I basically manage communications, but under the Signal Corps itself, we have our own symbols, we have our own songs, our own colors, We learn about history on how our Corps was established, and there's a lot of pride being associated with not only being a member of the military and then being a member of the National Guard, but also being a member of the Corps, and the actual job that I have is tied to a organization within itself that could be its own subculture. So there's lots of different ways that people can enter the military. I think this is also important to know when you're working with veterans, to have an understanding of not everybody goes to the recruiter and signs up to join the military and has a contract and does that contract. People enter the military in lots of different ways, and how you enter the military, again, can offer you a completely different experience. And if you're working with veterans, you're probably going to be working with veterans who have entered the military in multiple different ways. The military right now is a all volunteer force. So not everybody who's joining the military right now is, nobody is being drafted, they're volunteering, but you will be working with veterans who were drafted into the military. And that right there can be a traumatic experience in itself if that's not something that you set off to do. So we see that a lot with Vietnam veterans. So a lot of them were drafted, and that's not what they planned on doing. And people, they can enlist in the military, and they sign their contract. They have a period of time, and then they fulfill that contract. There's people who commission into the military, which they go through a commissioning source, which is a reserve officer training program. They go to a military academy. They receive a commission into the military and serve a period of time. They don't have a contract per se. They may have an obligation tied with maybe a monetary benefit they received for joining for education, but they don't have an enlistment. They have a commission, and when they leave the military, they resign that commission. So it's a little bit different than enlisting in the military for a time with a start date and an end date. There are actually even people who are skilled professionals that join the military as professionals. So there are certain jobs that exist out there that the military absolutely needs, and those jobs are very important. For instance, being a doctor is really important. So they may be going through medical school and then want to join the military, and then they join the military. And so they get a direct commission and they go off to their school. So, or maybe there's a chaplain. I know a chaplain who had his own parish, and he had been a chaplain for a priest. He had been a priest for many years and decided he wanted to join the military and be a chaplain. And that's what he did. He joined the military, earned a direct commission, and then went off to school. So there are key professions that the military needs and will direct commission somebody into the military. So people enter the military in lots of different ways. This is important to know, again, when you're building or understanding veterans is, they enter the military in lots of different ways. I think because a lot of people have not joined the military, or maybe not understand the military a lot, what we draw a lot is what we see on TV. So it's important if you're working with a veteran to kind of really know that, there's multiple ways that person could have entered the military. It could be involuntary or it could have been involuntary. And if it's involuntary, how did that impact that person? So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the transformation, or going from a civilian to a service member. So being an individual coming into the military, it's a really transformative process. People really become a part of a very structured organization. People are structured both individually and collectively. Imagine having your whole day laid out for you, week, month, year. I mean, and then if you look at a length of time in service, anywhere from 10 to 15 years, you're going from a very structured environment. That can be hard to make that transition, or, going from a very structured to having to establish your own structure. So, they really are very structured people. They learn that culturally. And then sometimes when they transition out, they have to establish a new form of structure. It can be very uncomfortable. And then from a cultural aspect, working with a veteran who may be used to a lot of structure, being on time, working with somebody or partnering with somebody, it may be difficult if they see that, maybe they're not as structured, or maybe they don't show up on time. So, culturally, it could be a kind of a sign of disrespect if you're working with a veteran and, you don't even show up on time for the appointment that you have with them. So structures are really important, and being punctual. It's a cultural trait that is learned in the military. They adopt a shared belief system. This kind of idea of service before self. Service members are expected to be apolitical. So you really, personal expression or your feelings maybe towards things that are going on, they don't express that. And it can be a hard thing to transition to after you've spent so much time in the military. So, regaining, what you stand for and what you believe for, reestablishing that personal autonomy is something that may take some time for veterans to do. They're expected to be something bigger than themselves. It's a very hierarchical organization. There's really the top down and the down up approach to communication. So that, again, that, if you think about it, can kind of cause some confusion when it comes to communicating post being in the armed forces, because you're used to communicating to a certain individual in a certain way. So the hierarchical piece, they're joining a hierarchical organization, but it can also impact communication. Cohesion really does become the norm. It's not an individual, it's a group. What we see is peer support works very well with veterans in this population, because cohesion is a part of the culture. Somebody is always taking care. Your people are taking care of you at the top and also at your right and your left. So when you're working with a justice or a veteran, it's really kind of important. You don't have to, you can be a peer and pick up some of the peer, in a sense, be a peer, but by checking in and making sure that the veteran is okay. But having a peer approach works very well with this population, because when they make that transition and when they're in the military, they're really taught to really work as a group, work collaboratively, and help and protect each other. So the military, it provides people there are so many different jobs in the military. And these jobs that they do sometimes offer lots of different skills and certifications. The military has made a huge transformation in the last 20 years to become more of a become a professionalized organization, and to really make sure that service members have certifications and skills that are transferable, more so now when they make that transition. But it's really important to know or learn a little bit about what a service member has done in the military. That can be used to really pull out and leverage and identify what their skills are and how those can be translated into, if it's their goal is to secure a job. What did you do in the military? Tell me a little bit about. I've actually had a conversation with several veterans to kind of pull out, what their job skills were. And, come to find out, a couple of them had certifications through their job in the military, and didn't even think to put that on their resume. So just realizing that veterans do more than just one thing. I think we see a lot on TV. We see the we may see a service member, that traditional infantry soldier, or service member, or soldier, Marine. But that's not all that people do in the military. There's doctors, there's nurses, there's attorneys, there's any job that you can see in the civilian world, there's probably the same job in the military. So these are just some things that I wanted to kind of highlight. This actually came from a survey that was conducted on veterans to gather information on what they want community providers to know. And they have, they have leadership skills. It doesn't matter what a service member's rank was in the military. Everybody in the military is a subject matter expert in what they do. And they are all, regardless of rank, are trained on leadership. So they make great leaders. They're resilient. They receive formal training in resilience. They can bounce back from adverse situations. They are, they can't identify their strengths. They are very resilient. We may not see that sometimes, what we see on TV or through media or what we hear. There are stereotypes that exist out there, but overall, collectively, veterans are very resilient, and they make very good people to collaborate with. Everybody's experience in the military is different, and it's really important to learn about their military experience and how that has impacted their lives, and so it's really important to kind of do that, to really understand who they are and to take that person-centered approach to care. There are multiple ways, a person can enter the military. We already talked about that. Veterans really value service and being a part of and connecting to community. One of the things I always highly suggest when working with veterans or trying to help them establish goals or get reintegrated with community is helping them establish ways they can serve the community in other aspects, whether that's to regain a purpose to serve, whether that's volunteering or, there's so many things that they can do to help their community. And this can be a very therapeutic process and also help with the reintegration part. But they do value service and connecting to the community. So a little bit about the, returning home process. About 18 million veterans are actually transitioned from the military. There are about 18 million American veterans in the United States, 18 million. 200,000 men and women actually leave the armed forces every day. A majority of our veteran population is male, about 91%. And 23% are actually minorities. And the largest group of veterans right now are Vietnam and post 9/11 veterans. So when veterans transition out of the military, these are kind of like the top things that we're seeing. And this actually came from the DoD 2018 Military to Civilian Transition Report. And these are the top reasons or the common challenges associated with reintegration to civilian life. So, navigating veteran resources and really understanding, where and what those are, finding employment, financial challenges, applying their military experience to actual job skills, making and really being able to articulate and translate those. Not that they don't have those skills, it's just translating those to a resume. And then also reconnecting with family. So these can also be, not being able to meet basic needs. can really increase one's own vulnerabilities to committing what we call crimes of survival or have justice involvement. Another, thing that we see and what we, that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 4 men who have served have also experienced military sexual trauma. Military sexual trauma, it's not a diagnosis, it's actually an overarching term that also, that it kind of includes harassment, sexual assault, and hazing that a veteran may or a service member may experience while they are in the military. And unfortunately, this can sometimes, spill over into civilian life. People were victimized. There are veterans who were victimized in the military. And then what we also see when we look at justice-involved veterans, unfortunately, is that veterans who are in prison, a higher percentage, about 35%, have been convicted of a violent sex offense. So it may be a little bit harder working with that. Maybe that or individual, because they may not be eligible when it comes to providing housing, because they may have limitations on what type of housing that they can have because of a sex offense. But it's just, the sexual assault is a societal issue. It's not just a military issue. It does affect the military members in the military, but unfortunately, some predators may leave the military and commit those offenses. Our veterans, and if you're working with those individuals when they're transitioning out of the departments of corrections, being able to have housing benefits may be limited because of their offense. And we'll talk a little bit about justice involvement and what the limitations are with justice involvement in certain offenses on military benefits. Some other things that veterans face, some veterans, suicide. 20 veterans a day commit suicide. Homelessness disproportionately affects veterans. Some veterans too. Every night, about 40,000 veterans are homeless. Some have service-connected, 4 million veterans have service-connected disabilities. Some of these can be mitigating factors that lead to veterans' justice involvement. For being suicidal, can lead to risky behaviors. I knew, I'll share kind of a little story about, there was a veteran one time that was contemplating suicide, and somebody called up the police and sent them over there. The veteran had a gun, and the veteran, they did a health and welfare check on the veteran, and unfortunately, the veteran had a gun. They took the gun from the veteran, but then they found out that the gun was, the FOID card was expired. So the veteran actually ended up having justice involvement because they were suicidal and because the police intervened and came over to find out that that person had an expired FOID card. So some of these factors of veterans sleeping on the street or not having stable housing can lead to justice involvement itself. And these are things that, because of a veteran is locked up, of course, that the work that you're doing with this population, the justice involved population, is these are things that need to be addressed pre and post incarceration. So when they return to the community, these factors that led to their justice involvement need to be addressed before and right at when they return to community. And what we want to do is to be able to provide you with resources for veterans can address some of these issues that we're seeing associated with this population. Not all, but some. These are the top issues we're seeing. A majority of veterans are not suicidal, they're not homeless, but it does, if you look at top issues that some veterans face, these are things, and these can lead to justice involvement. So I think it's really kind of important also to talk about who is a veteran. This can be very confusing because the term veteran means different things to different people. And veteran, the definition of veteran, my personal definition is anybody who's ever put on a uniform. And there are some organizations out there that will provide service to a veteran on that definition alone. But for most benefits, when it comes to federal benefits, a veteran has to kind of fall into one of these two categories. It kind of refers to a person who has served on active duty, and they have to have served other conditions that were other than honorable. And so serving on active duty, and they kind of split it up in two ways. So if it was prior to September 8th, 1980, they have to have served 180 days consecutively on active duty. But if it's after September 8th, 1980, they have to have served 24 months on active duty. Now, for people who are in the reserves or the National Guard, they do their 1 week in a month, twice. They do their 2 weeks a year. That doesn't count. Training doesn't count. They have to have been called up to active duty. And that has to have been for their time duration. So they have to have been called to active duty and completed their time of service. And it has to have been honorably. Now, if they're disabled or something, if they're disabled or injured during their line of duty, they are considered a veteran. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the justice-involved veteran population. It is, they do make up a majority of the veterans that have served in the military or are in the military do not have justice involvement. What we're seeing is about 8% of the state and federal prisoners, and they make up about 7% of jail inmates. And then a majority, 67%, really served between 1974 and 2000. So a majority of the veterans who have justice involvement, they have been separated from the military for a quite long period of time. But I think what's the most important to know is that even though it's a small population, you still may have interactions with veterans. But it's also important to know and be aware of veteran resources because a majority, about 77%, have served honorably. And one thing I will say about these numbers is that they're really based on self-reporting. So they may be significantly higher. It's just that maybe the veteran doesn't feel that they want to disclose that information, or there's no benefit in them identifying themselves as a veteran. I think what we tend to see is where there's jails and prisons, if there's jails that have veteran pods, places where veterans can go collectively, they tend to want to self-identify more if there is an incentive associated with it. So there probably is significantly way more veterans that have some type of justice involvement, but they're just not identified or screened, or maybe even asked that question. So one of the things that we always suggest doing is really screening for military service. When you're, screen all of your clients that you're working with for military service. And I always suggest kind of using this approach, this ask, listen, and learn approach. Screen and, and use a more inclusive definition. Have you, instead of saying, are you a veteran? Or have you been discharged from the armed forces? People, they actually do retire. So that may not even, or they may still be actively in the military. So asking if they've been discharged from the armed forces, maybe not a good term, or but we may be using something more. Have you ever served in the armed forces? Is a great way to first, identify veterans. Some people will try to use the definition, have you honorably served? I would strongly suggest not using that. Just, have you ever served in the armed forces? And then asking some, additional follow-up questions. I'm going to kind of just turn it to this slide here. But here it kind of talks a little bit about, here are some maybe things to learn, ask additional questions to kind of learn about their experience and how that experience really has shaped their lives or impacted their lives. Things like how long did you serve can maybe give you an idea if they are going to be eligible for certain benefits. What type of job did they have can help you work with that veterans to really pull out the skills that they need to identify to possibly get that job that they need to help stabilize their situation. When did you separate from the armed forces? Gives you an idea of how connected or how long they've been back to the community. Are you connected? Are you enrolled in the VA? If not, why? I think that's a really important question. These are some examples of questions. I always suggest that not just screening everybody, but if somebody says yes, just, have a little, maybe a document that you keep with some questions to learn a little bit more about their military history, to see maybe were they injured? And if so, if they had a significant injury and maybe that impacts their ability to work, then maybe they need to file a claim with the VA. These are some examples of questions you may be able to ask to learn a little bit more about a veteran's military experience and how that impacts them. If you, on the screen, there's kind of a little code. If you click on that, it'll bring you, I'll just kind of pull it up real quick. It'll kind of bring you to this little sheet here. It has some really good examples of military history health questions to ask, or some information maybe you can include in the little list of questions that you ask to kind of understand how, from the veteran, how their service has impacted them. It also has some good information on different resources and maybe how to screen about military sexual trauma. So this is a good, kind of example to, pull from when you're kind of formulating your questions to learn a little bit more about your veteran client. So after you've listened, learn, take some time to learn about how what you've heard can be used to help that veteran help themselves. I always suggest, again, really using a strength-based approach. Veterans are very, very aware of their strengths. A part of military culture and a part of military training is to pull those out very early on. They're very well aware of their strengths and also their weaknesses. And I always suggest when you're working with veterans in a case management setting or you're establishing goals is to really help, to really learn from their strengths and how they can be used to help them establish goals. I also always suggest with case management, again, it being a person-centered approach. Using language, I know, really drawing from them, such as, tell me a little bit about where you want to see yourself. What does success look like for you a year from now? So, tell me what needs to happen in order for that to happen. Instead of saying, let's make SMART goals around your vision, maybe a more culturally appropriate way, maybe like, let's talk about establishing a course of action plan from what you've just told me you want it to be a year from now. So, SMART goals versus course of action plan, culturally, language wise, it may resonate a little bit more Other strategies I suggest also is, leveraging military culture to really help inspire and invoke change with veterans. For instance, an example of that could be in the military, they have a code of conduct. Maybe working with a veteran to establish their own personal code of conduct. Also, instead, the military and veterans have, for years, they have their own. The military has core values. Each branch has its own. It's embedded culturally in each service member, and maybe using that same approach. Now let's come up with your own independent core values. So just kind of leveraging some of what they're taught in the military and their culture to help veterans establish goals or, value themselves. But choosing bits and pieces of culture is a good strategy I also suggest as well. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some, barriers to self-identifying. So the biggest barrier to self-identifying or veterans being identified is not being asked the question. Identify, screen all of your veteran or any client that you have, screen for veteran status using the definition, have you ever served in the armed forces? Safety fears or stereotypes is a huge one. There are a lot of stereotypes that, veterans, maybe they don't want to self-identify because they don't want to be grouped or categorized, or, they don't want to, the stereotypes exist. That can be a barrier to self-identifying. So being a part of trainings like this, understanding and learning about this culture, I think can help reduce those stereotypes that make veterans feel more comfortable self-identifying. The definition of veteran itself, not using one that is more inclusive, kind of limits that opportunity for veterans to be able to say, yes, I have served. There's also that lack of perception of need. If a veteran doesn't see what's the benefit of me self-disclosing, then they may not, feel comfortable with doing that or not see why. One strategy that I always kind of suggested is, if you're working with a lot of different clients and they're coming in and out of your office, even if they say no, they're not a veteran, sometimes I'll just keep, I always suggest keeping literature that speaks to different veteran benefits. And if they see those things, they maybe in the future may feel more comfortable as self-identifying, like, oh, this person knows a lot about veteran benefits. Maybe I should, say, hey, yeah, I am a veteran. So if they see that there's a benefit of self-identifying, then it might not be by you just asking, but just by providing literature and having things in there that kind of opens up that idea that, yes, there is a benefit to self-identifying. Safety fears can also be, a barrier to self-identifying. Depending on the times right now and what's going on in the military, people may not feel comfortable self-identifying. I know the events, that happened a couple of months ago or last month. I personally didn't feel comfortable disclosing my military affiliation because of, units were being called up and I just didn't want to self-identify. So I think that if there's things going on and people feel a certain way, for instance, you'll probably have veterans, especially that you're working with, who were Vietnam era veterans. They didn't have a welcome home. They, some of them maybe faced lots of verbal abuse when they came home, being called baby killers. They were shut out of services. So for them, they may still be scared to say, yes, I'm a veteran. There also may be some shame associated with it. If they have justice involvement, if they're pulling back on their core values, and when they join the military, they may be shameful for what they've done and had justice involvement. Maybe they don't want to disclose because they feel like in some way they kind of portrayed their community by committing a crime. So there's lots of different barriers that exist, it's really kind of important that they're going to exist even if you ask we also encourage to continue to ask that question when you're working with clients, and keep materials in your offices or in shared spaces that can resonate and speak to veterans and make them more comfortable or open to disclosing that information if they see they can something can come from it that will help benefit what they're trying to do. So very quickly, yes. Okay, so I just wanted to just do an overview really of the VA. So we kind of have this overarching term that we call VA, but the VA is actually broken down into 3 different components. And over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about the different benefits of the different components. Well, actually 2. We're not going to really talk about the National Cemetery Association, but I thought I would highlight that branch as well. So there's 3 branches of the VA, and within the 3 branches, they do provide different types of benefits. So the National Cemetery Association, they are the kind of the smallest branch. They actually provide the national shrines, final resting places to honor veterans. So they maintain about 135 different national cemeteries, in 33 or 41 states. So this is kind of important. And then I think there's the other states that don't have national cemeteries. The states pick up on the task of maintaining cemeteries for veterans. So this can be a source for, maybe if a veteran passes away, and they meet eligibility requirements, they have served honorably, they can have funeral expenses paid for. It can also be used if they lose a loved one. If they have a spouse, they can be buried in a national cemetery. And then if they have dependents under 21, and then there are some additional criteria. If they have, if they have a dependent who's a college student, it can be up to 23. And if they have a dependent who has a physical or mental disability, and they are a dependent, then there's no age limit. So there's the VBA, the Veterans Benefits Administration, and their whole job is really to provide benefits that veterans are eligible, education, disability. There's a lot of different benefits. We'll talk a little bit more about those and follow-up webinars. And then there's the Healthcare Administration, the Veterans Health Administration that takes care of healthcare for veterans, and there's different benefits that you'll hear about in the next webinar. Connecting, there's multiple ways that veterans can connect to the VA. They can call, they can send, they can fill out this form and send it via mail, or they can actually go to their local VA medical center, clinic, or State Department of Veteran Affairs, and an individual or a staff will help enroll them. This is one thing I wanted to make sure that I brought up. This right here is a great benefit or a great resource for community providers. The VA actually develops this once a year. It's pretty much, it goes over different benefits for veterans, education, healthcare. Just pull it up real quick. They publish another one every year. This is the most recent one. You can access it online. It pretty much will give you a breakdown on eligibility, all the different types of programs federal programs that veterans are eligible for. I highly encourage everybody to look this up, download a copy. You can actually even contact the VA. They'll send you some. But be familiar with those resources. It's a great tool to have. So just kind of to wrap up, screening is important. Screen for veteran status. Take the time to listen, and not just listen, but learn how their services can be used to help them help themselves. And then take the time to really learn about veteran-specific resources. This can be really enhance the case management and the services that you're providing to these veterans pre and post incarceration. And so this pretty much goes over our different webinars that we're going to be having. We're going to be providing resources on healthcare that can help justice-involved veterans, employment. We'll talk a little about VA disability and education resources. And we'll also talk about veteran-specific housing resources. We have some really great subject matter experts who have lots of experiences working with veterans, going into the jails and the prisons and making sure they get connected to benefits. And then we'll wrap up in August 12th with a panel of key subject matter experts who will be available to answer questions about working with justice-involved veterans. So at this time, what I'm going to do is, I guess I've got maybe a minute or so, I can open it up for questions if anybody has them.